All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Nishant Sharma, a visiting researcher at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Institute for this week's edition of Wednesday seminar. Today's seminar is on South Korea's foreign policy under the Yoon Suk-yeol administration. With the recently concluded closely contested presidential elections in South Korea, there is a change expected in foreign policy outlook of the new administration. Today's discussion will attempt to decipher and throw light on Yoon Suk-yeol's foreign policy approach and its implications for the region. We have an illustrious panel today for this task. Our first speaker for the day is Lee Sang-hyun, Senior Research Fellow, Sejong Institute, and President, Korea Nuclear Policy Society. Our second speaker is Dr. Sandeep Mishra, Associate Professor at the Center for East Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Honorary Fellow at ICS. Our third speaker for the day is Dr. Angana Guha Roy, Research Associate, Delhi Policy Group. Today's session will be chaired by Mr. Skan Ranjan Teal, former Ambassador of India to the Republic of Korea and Adjunct Fellow, ICS. Now, before we proceed, some housekeeping rules. All participants are requested to remain muted during the course of the event. Please pose your questions and comments during the Q&A session, or you can also raise your hand. Please unmute yourself only when called upon by the chair to do so. I will now hand over the proceedings to the chair. You may take over, sir.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Ashok Kanta, Sir, Ambassador Nambiar, Sandeep, other friends. It's a very important topic which the Institute of Chinese Studies has chosen today for this session, South Korea's foreign policy under the new president, Yoon Suk-yeol. To give a little bit of a background, of course, he is the 13th president of Republic of Korea after the Second World War. Himself, he is a former prosecutor general, not an active politician in a manner of speaking. But if we look at the presidents who have ruled South Korea, Republic of Korea, let us start from since the advent of democracy. Before that, of course, Syngman Rhee and etc. were there. But since, say, late 1980s, once the country became democratic, the sixth president was General Roh Tae-woo. Again, a general, then became politician. So it was kind of a transition phase from dictatorship to democracy. And he ruled from 1988 to 1993. Following him was the seventh president, Kim Young-sam, 1993-98, and he really consolidated democracy in South Korea. After that, in the presidents who ruled or who won democratically, three were, one can say, liberal or left of the center and Democratic Party candidates. Kim Dae-jung, 1998 to 2003, Roh Moo-hyun, 2003-2008, and the predecessor to President Yoon, Moon Jae-in, 2017 to 2022, early 22. And on the other side, the conservatives and their party's name keeps changing. So it was sometimes Senuri Party, now the latest name is People Power Party. Their first president was Lee Myung-bak when I was ambassador there, 2008-13. Then Park Geun-hye, 2013-17. She was impeached, as all of us know. And now President Yoon Suk-yeol is from that tradition or wing of or side of South Korean polity. Now, it is important, all of us here are knowledgeable about East Asia, about Korea, but still it is important to recognize once again the fault lines in the South Korean society post Second World War. And of course, the last president of the provisional government of ROK, Kim Koo, was assassinated by a Korean army lieutenant on 26 June 1949, and it had an impact on the developments in Korean Peninsula. Because there was a very strong feeling in the many Korean, even South Korean politicians of that time, statesmen of that time, that the Koreans will be able to sort out their issues, and there was no need to country to be divided, etc. But US had its own reasons and views, and Syngman Rhee was imported and imposed by US occupation forces on South Korea. And he was president from 1948 to 1960, absolutely authoritarian and undemocratic, and whatever you have, you can have your own assessment. And a lot of analysts, who in my view are independent, they say that Syngman Rhee administration was supported by the collaborators of Japanese colonial rule, army, police, petty officials of the Korean, when there was Japanese colonization, landowners, etc. So that regime was disconnected from the masses of South Korea. And that has really led to some very enduring divisions in the South Korean society, South Korean polity. And there are two broad currents. One, conservatives, pro-US, strongly anti-communist, and they want strict reciprocity in relations with North Korea, as things have evolved. And the second broad current is of the liberals or the Democrats. Moon Jae-in was the last president, which of course is very close to US in security related issues, but has a feeling that US should keep out of inter-Korean relations if they want to improve their relations. US should let them allow more space in peninsular affairs. And the masses have a feeling which is still there. Now, of course, new generation has come up, that US Army was partly responsible for suppression of dissent and human rights during the Park Chung-hee and the Syngman Rhee regimes. They were responsible for Jeju Uprising Massacre 1948, 30,000-40,000 people were killed, as well as the Gwangju Uprising in 1980, when more than 150 civilians were killed officially, because the Korean army had fired on those civilians. With passage of time, fault lines have blurred, but exist. And that is reflected in this, that President Yoon Suk-yeol has won by a razor-thin majority of 0.75%. And the National Assembly is still controlled by Democratic majority. The opposition controls the... So his room to maneuver would be restricted. Now, what are the major foreign policy issues before any South Korean leader? One and foremost, whether it is theoretical or practical, remains reunification with North Korea. It is part of the discourse. And the two sides have followed different policies. We all know about Sunshine Policy, 2000 summit between Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il, 2007 summit. Again, the Democratic, that side is following this line of summits. 2007 summit between Roh Moo-hyun and Kim Jong-il. And of course, 2018, the 3 summits between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un. Whereas the Lee Myung-bak kept away from North Korea as well as Park Geun-hye. Second issue is the strategic relations with United States, that what should be the intensity. And some analysts do believe that President Moon Jae-in, the predecessor, the outgoing, who left, he was perhaps following a very equidistant kind of a strategic policy between US and China. He froze the deployment of THAAD batteries, whereas President Yoon perhaps will follow comprehensive strategic alliance with US, etc. I'm sure our panelists will speak about it. And in my view, Sandeep, correct me if I am wrong, President Moon Jae-in may not have attended the NATO Madrid summit on 28th, 30 June. I really would think so, but please comment on it. Third major issue before any leader of South Korea, as well as the National Assembly, is the relations with Japan. Conservatives want to move on, whereas for Democrats, the mass, the base, the support base of Democratic Party, the left of the center party, still clings to this highly emotional historical legacy of comfort women, compensation for slave labor, etc. And now that President Yoon has very publicly said that he wants to improve relations with Japan, how he will handle it, our panelists will discuss. And then the more recent issue, which is very important, is the relations with China. New factor, and President Yoon has made some observations about Quad, and he has even used the word Indo-Pacific. That also is a major issue. Now, President-elect Yoon's policy statements have been there, and article in Foreign Affairs of 8 February 2022, one interview to Washington Post of 14 April 2022. Then, of course, he attended the NATO summit in Madrid. I'll not dwell on it because I'm sure our panelists will speak at length about this. And one will, of course, watch carefully the future direction, whether more THAAD batteries will be allowed to come in, what will be the level and scope of interaction with Quad and Indo-Pacific, whether there will be cap on Russian oil. There was, I think the US Treasury Secretary was to go there to South Korea, and one of the agenda item was that how South Korea will participate in whatever NATO is deciding on the cap on the Russian oil, the price cap. And the Korean side has been saying that they want to know the details before they comment. On India-ROK relations, there is a very strong bipartisan support in South Korea as far as special strategic partnership with India is concerned. So in my view, it will be stronger and on the same path, and one doesn't really anticipate any major change in that. So to talk about these issues and more, we have a very eminent panel. Their biodata are far, the speakers have already been circulated. So I invite now first the Mr. Song Hyun Lee, a senior research fellow at the Sejong Institute, who has been former president of Korea Nuclear Policy Society. About 10 to 15 minutes, Dr. Lee. Please, floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Taya. Well, actually, I have two president positions. I'm president of the Sejong Institute and also president of the Korean Nuclear Policy Society. Well, thank you for inviting me to today's webinar because it is quite timely. My understanding is that even though Yoon Suk-yeol administration initiated a few months ago, and also it very broadly suggests its foreign policy stance, but still a lot of aspect of its foreign policy is not in detail yet. So perhaps government agencies, MOFA and other government ministry is working hard to come up with a more detailed and concrete policy issues. And thank you for introducing South Korea's recent politics. And you also mentioned some of the divide line in South Korean society. I think I absolutely agree with you. Well, you see, you mentioned two trends in South Korean foreign policy stance. One is the liberal, The other one is conservative, and they have a substantial different perspective on either US or North Korea and Japan and China. I think that's the still continuing legacy of South Korean history. And also recently, in the latest election, as you exactly mentioned that Yoon won the election with very narrow margin, just 0.6 something like that vote of the popular vote. And also in Korean policy recently, in Korean society, we have a few more divided lines. One is the gender, the other one is the generation gap. So these days, South Korean politics is quite complicated, and even though I'm living in Korea, I frankly do not have much understanding of what's going on among younger generations. So here you are. And what do I have to say about Yoon Suk-yeol's foreign policy stance? Think about in what circumstances, what kind of a foreign policy environment that Yoon government must face in the future. I usually point out three big sets of challenges for Yoon administration. One is the so-called systemic fragmentation, already begun with the COVID-19 pandemic, due to the intensifying competition among global powers and deteriorating international governance and the weakening of international institutions and norms worldwide. So we don't have much function of the international governance. So the whole international system is quite fragmented, and because of that, we need a lot of effort to coordinate the global on major global issues. That's the one set of challenges. A second set of challenges are obviously the new trends toward a new Cold War. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, we already know that there's a serious competition is going on between US and China. So US-China strategic competition. And worse, it's worsened by Russian invasion of Ukraine recently. So since the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think that the international order is quickly reshaping into a new Cold War. Well, this is not exactly the Cold War that we have witnessed a few decades ago, but the overall formation of the international order is looking like that. So on the one hand, we have US and Europe, and the so-called liberal democracy and market economy countries. On the other hand, we have China, Russia, and other many authoritarian governments. So in that sense, it is a very strict, structurally very rigid structure. And also because of that, countries like Korea and many other countries caught in between those two formation blocks. Then this will be quite an uncomfortable situation will continue. We already know that there's a lot of disruption in supply chain. We also heard of the possibility of energy and food security, food crisis. So this is another set of challenges that you must navigate through in the near future. And third set of challenges is the strategic situation on the Korean Peninsula. I think you mentioned that past administration of Korea, Moon Jae-in government, have a very high priority in expanding peace mechanism on the Korean Peninsula. But unfortunately, this plan did not work well. So after the Hanoi summit, unsuccessful Hanoi summit between US and DPRK, you know that a US DPRK dialogue has been completely stopped. And also because of the inter-Korean dialogue has also stopped. Now, because of the pandemic, North Korea voluntarily completely shut down its national border. So whatever the international community is trying to offer to the North Korean regime simply does not respond. And meanwhile, they are continuing to make their missile and nuclear capabilities much more stronger these days. So facing that kind of a hostile environment, one of the foreign policy stance that Yoon chose is that the so-called global pivotal state, which means that South Korea want to contribute to freedom, peace, and prosperity based on more bold diplomacy and strong security. and that goes far beyond the Korean Peninsula. Okay, this may sound a little bit ambitious plan, and South Korea want to be that kind of nation. So far, our priority on security, national foreign policy and security policy has been mostly Korean Peninsula and nearby region in Northeast Asia. But Yoon Suk-yeol government is trying to expand that horizon in a much more broader way to engage better with the global community. So having said that, what about the alliance policy? Well, Yoon Suk-yeol already made it clear that South Korea will pursue a comprehensive strategic alliance with the United States. Interestingly, previous liberal government, Moon Jae-in government, has already agreed with the U.S. in the last May summit with the United States. So what does the comprehensive strategic alliance means? That means both deepening economic and political ties with Washington, as well as expanding the cooperation beyond the Korean Peninsula to address more regional and global challenges. In latest Yoon Suk-yeol Biden summit in Korea, both leaders addressed the key alliance issues like the ROK-US alliance, the linchpin for peace and prosperity, and both nations will pursue strategic economic and technology partnership, and comprehensive strategic alliance beyond the Korean Peninsula, which will include cooperation in global issues such as Ukraine, climate change, COVID-19, cyberspace, and so on. So having said that, perhaps there is a little bit subtle difference in priority in comparison with the previous government. Well, Moon Jae-in government, as a liberal government, has a high priority in expanding inter-Korean cooperation and relationship. As I mentioned, unfortunately, this initiative did not work well. And in comparison, Yoon Suk-yeol government is trying to expand its foreign policy stance, not just only on North Korea, but also beyond the Korean Peninsula, and try to expand its scope and content in foreign policy area. And what about the China policy? Previous government, Moon Jae-in government, has been quite generous toward China because they expect some kind of a contribution from China to solve North Korea's nuclear issue. But unfortunately, it turned out that China's role has been quite disappointing. And because of that, Yoon Suk-yeol government declared that it will pursue a mutually respectable ROK-China relations. And I'm not sure how China will respond to this initiative, but anyhow, South Korean point of view is clear. There is no reason that South Korea deliberately antagonized China. But however, in the wake of President Yoon's attendance at NATO summit, China does not hide its unpleasant position toward the South Korean and threatens to have a negative consequence for Korea-China relations in the future. So still, we do not know how seriously China will respond to Yoon government's foreign policy stand in the future. But anyhow, that's the current situation. And finally, let me briefly address the Indo-Pacific strategy and ROK-India relations and conclude. Well, South Korea's one of the major policy has been the so-called New Southern policy. And most people believe it has many common features with the Indo-Pacific strategy. And I'm not sure how India will perceive that Indo-Pacific strategy. But anyhow, New Southern policy and Indo-Pacific strategy has a little more, many common grounds to work with. So some of the issues that South Korean government is discussing with other countries, for example, in NATO summit, not NATO summit. Recently, a high-ranking official from EU visited Korea, and he gave us some of the possible areas of cooperation between Korea and Indo-Pacific strategy. Some of the issue was addressed like this: strengthening rule-based international order, supply chain disruption, energy and food crisis, carbon neutrality, sustainable economic prosperity, green transition, ocean governance like overfishing, plastic pollution, and UNCLOS issue, and digital governance and connectivity, human security, and defense procurement cooperation. I think I would say South Korea and India shares common security concerns regarding China, both South China Sea and peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. But nevertheless, perhaps we also share the one concern that South Korea's either South Korea's New Southern policy or in general in the Pacific strategy should not be a kind of a military action against either China or Russia. So my understanding is the South Korean government is a little more cautious that even though it either pursue and work with the Indo-Pacific strategy and New Southern policy, it is desirable for South Korea to refrain from a direct military action against China or Russia. And having said that, some of the challenges obvious. You already mentioned that Yoon faces the very serious domestic political hurdles. National Assembly is dominated by opposition party with a huge margin of numbers, and also immediate challenge is the North Korea's nuclear and missile provocations. Beginning since early this year, North Korea already testified 18 missiles. So this will not be very pleasant situation from Korean perspective. But nevertheless, South Korean government, the Yoon Suk-yeol government will try hard to navigate through this uncertain environment. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prosecutor, for very pithy and very important remarks. And yes, of course, we were also very surprised to see how gender issue had become such an important issue in this election.
And they issue for just the young people, interesting among young people in their 20s, something like that.
Yes, it was surprising for outsiders, I think. And the three challenges you mentioned, is a systematic deterioration in international governance, fears of a new Cold War, and strategic change in Korean Peninsula. I think the whole world is facing these issues. And the leaders of countries like India and Korea need to work together to how to address these. Then on this, President Yoon's assertion to broaden the horizon of foreign policy outside Korean Peninsula, yes, it is an interesting aspiration. And in Q&A, perhaps I will have a question for you on this. On China policy, yes, it will be, the whole world will be watching how China reacts to Korea's new, if it becomes more assertive stance towards United States. And I was quite surprised that China did not show their wolf warrior kind of a attacking statements against President Yoon's participation in the Madrid NATO summit. I think China is a little chastened country now. So thank you very much. I now invite Professor Sandeep Mishra, Center for East Asian Studies. All of us familiar with Professor Mishra. He was my colleague in Delhi University. And he knows both North Korea and South Korea very, very well. So over to you, Sandeep.
Thank you, sir. It's really a pleasure to meet President Lee again after a few weeks and listen to his opinion about South Korea's foreign policy choices under new administration. And as I think Ambassador Tyal also covered and President Lee also mentioned, I would like to say that, look, any foreign policy decision making is located, actually, if we read theory of foreign policy, I think there are three important variables which influence. There are many, but I think three broadly could be categorized. One is basically domestic setup. So domestic variables are important. They decide foreign policy choices. Second is basically international or say external variables, they are also important. And the third, personality factor or leadership, which is also called idiosyncratic factors. So I think about domestic factors, Tyal sir also mentioned about how Korean society had been, you can say, different fault lines, which further I think was told by President Lee that how there are several fault lines, region, gender, generation, ideological. So all these divisions are there, and they, whenever a particular conservative party comes to power, I think they have a certain kind of outlook for Korea, and accordingly they pursue their foreign policy. About international setup also, I will talk about a bit later on. But I think I would like to draw your attention to why actually this time so much anticipation was there that South Korean foreign policy is going to have a very big change. And the reason was that when Yoon Suk-yeol came to power, I think before coming to power, when he was fighting elections, he made several statements which were supposed to be very, you can say, unconventional. Like he told that he would like to have again reintroduction of tactical nuclear weapons from America, which was actually 1992 America withdrew, and then nobody were talking about that. But actually he proposed that he may think about it. He also even, because if you take about THAAD, THAAD, terminal high altitude, that's aerial defense system. So that anti-missile system was also South Korea accepted during Park Geun-hye era. But you can see overall the debate, governments all, even Park Geun-hye was also coming from same political ideological tradition, but he was quite reluctant to accept THAAD. Whereas Yoon Suk-yeol, he said that he would like to have more THAAD batteries on Korean Peninsula. He said that he's going to have preemptive strike on North Korea if North Korea, if it looks that North Korea is going to attack some missiles on South Korea. Or say he made a statement saying that if Yeongpyeong Island, there was some sailing from North Korea in 2010. So if similar situation happened, we can attack on what we call point of origin. So these were quite strong statements, and people thought that I think big changes may come to South Korean foreign policy. But if I look at, still it's premature to evaluate, but I think at least 2-3 months he had been to power. 10th of May he started. And if you can see that there have been some actions of South Korean government, which appears to be moving in the same direction, which like he had openly after getting elected, he has said that ready to join Quad if he is invited. He had bilateral summit with the United States. Biden came just within 11 days. He came to South Korea. He had, I think, with Japan also, he's trying to improve relations. He actually, when North Korea twice, actually in late May and early June, when North Korea tested their missiles, next day or in 1 or 2 days, South Korea also had their own missile tests. So that kind of tit for tat, which was not there generally, he did that. He participated, you mentioned, I think mentioned as a participatory, let's say, a partner, close partner of NATO summit, Madrid. And first time it happened that a South Korean president participated, because already 3 countries like Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, they have their special, you can say, consulate for that. Sometimes, I think, I'm not sure, but I think probably in Brussels. And South Korea is also supposedly going to have it because they want to have constant touch with NATO. I think these things are quite remarkable, quite different. And people, they thought that, I think, but I think fortunately, he had not been talking about more THAAD batteries and reintroduction of tactical nuclear weapons so far. When I try to comprehend his ideas about South Korean foreign policy, I realized that he's quite aware about 2-3 important variables. One, South Korea is a very important economy. 2021, South Korea moved If you look at the trade volume, South Korean trade volume was 1.3 trillion US dollar, $664 billion export only. And it became from 9th to 8th big economy of the 8th, you can say, trading economy of the world. So I think that's one important variable which he knows. And then I think Korean cultural products, they have become quite popular. Soft power of Korea has been improving. This is another important. And I think three, that I think South Korean defense and defense modernization. I think South Korea is also one of the important 7 or 8 defense players, spending almost 50 billion US dollar per annum. I think latest report of CP, it's 50 billion US dollar. I think actually he aspire actually, Yoon Suk-yeol, he aspires to become some kind of South Korea to become a global player. Actually, when 21st May, Biden came to South Korea and they had joint statement. So they mentioned about global comprehensive strategic alliance beyond the Korean Peninsula. So there was one section in the joint statement saying beyond Korean Peninsula, global comprehensive partnership. And as President Lee mentioned about how South Korea is seeking to become global pivotal state, means they want to have more, you can say, role in global politics. And actually, recently, 22nd of June, National Security Advisor of South Korea, Kim Sung-han, he said that we are going to create a comprehensive security network through NATO summit and with other, you can say, mechanism, like-minded countries, and we would like to have our policy for any unpredictable global situation. So I think it seems that it's quite ambitious policy, and I think South Korean Yoon Suk-yeol has been also doing all those things. His personality factor is he's quite maverick. He's very, I think, energetic. He comes out with, so sometimes foreign minister, Park Jin and other people, they have to probably moderate him that we can be slightly more nuanced about our statements. But when I look at international, like structurally how Korea is located, Tayal sir mentioned about how liberal president, suppose if I have to draw a very big picture, broad picture, liberal president, what they want? Generally, they want that, look, America is our security ally, but at the same time, we need autonomy. We need to have our own, you can say, and that's why wartime command also, even like peacetime command, already it has gone to South Korea. So this a bit autonomy inside alliance system with the US. With China, a liberal president would like to have already enough economic cooperation is there. But I think more trust in economic partnership and other, you can say, other areas where they can cooperate. With China, a liberal president would like that Japan should change its approach, stance, and then only I think a much more durable relationship could be established. With North Korea, a liberal president would like that let's engage, and engagement is the way through which we can deal with North Korea. Quite contrast, a conservative president, what they think that, look, we need to be closest ally of the United States. So they are quite, you can say, quite clear about that. If you take last 3 conservative presidents, say Lee Myung-pak, Park Geun-hye, and Yoon Suk-yeol, you can see that that America is the most important part. Actually, during presidential elections, one presidential debate, Yoon Suk-yeol was said that you please rank US, China, Japan, Korea in order of preference. And he said US number 1, Japan number 2, China number 3, and North Korea number 4. So I think they want America to be, they want to be very close to America. With China, a conservative president, they want that, look, we need to have economic relationship, but we should not appease China. And we should be much more, you can say, if possible, diversify our economic exchanges with other countries also. With Japan, they feel that even if there are certain problems, let's engage with Japan. With North Korea, normally a conservative president, they feel that, look, let's have kind of demand reciprocity. In very, I think, bluntly, you can say tit for tat. If you do something good, I will do something good to you. Otherwise, it's other way around. So I think this is the normal structural thing. But you know, if you look at certain realities, which are basically like liberal president would like to do all these things I mentioned, conservative president would like to do all these things which I mentioned. But structural reality is that, look, any president they like or they don't like, America had been security ally of South Korea for so many decades. They have provided all important technological and other assistance at the time of need. And that is not going to just wither away. That's going to be there. So even if you want to seek autonomy, as liberals they try to seek, you can't have enough autonomy which you would like to have. Suppose I told you about wartime control and peacetime control. It has been principally decided that wartime control of Joint Command will go to South Korean commander, but the date has been postponed and postponed. I don't know, at least 10 times it has been postponed. Still, it hasn't been done. The reason is that security alliance is very, very strong, very, very, you can say, entrenched in their bilateral relations. Similarly, with China, even if suppose Yoon Suk-yeol want to have no appeasement to China, or say slightly more straightforward to China, he can't forget that right now 362 billion. Last year, the bilateral trade was 362.5 billion with China. And that is basically more than South Korean trade with US, Japan, and EU combined. So I think you can't just, you can say, because it's going to hurt you. It's going to have cost for you. I think similarly with Japan, yes, I think Japan is a very important economic partner of South Korea. But at the same time, history issue, territorial disputes, and unfavorable public opinion inside South Korea, they are going to be there. You can't just like say do away with them. So I think similarly with North Korea, it's a divided country. It's a part of South Korea in a way, Korea, and there have been policy of engagement as well as containment, hardline, and both the policies have been less than satisfactory so far. So I think given the structural reality, even if a conservative or say a liberal president, they would like to do whatever they want to do, but these structural reality, they bring them back. So Yoon Suk-yeol, even if he wanted more third battery on the Korean Peninsula, more tactical nuclear weapons on Korean Peninsula, but I think he had to be careful because ultimately 362 billion trade is going to be important. It's until unless you diversify them, and it takes years actually. If you want to have a what you call alternate supply chain or say resilient supply chain, which they have been talking about, they need time. So ultimately they can't. I would talk a bit about China and then I will stop. Yes, I think as mentioned by other speakers that it's going to be the most important relationship which we have to observe, because I think even if he was very active, very aggressive about his statement towards China, but I think after coming to power, he has been slightly mellowed down. And from Chinese side also, you can see that actually when Madrid NATO summit was happening, Chinese foreign policy spokesperson was criticizing in a press conference, criticizing Japan and saying that actually they want to bring NATO into Asia Pacific, which is going to be disastrous. But he did not mention anything about Korea. And when journalists, they asked specifically question about South Korea, he still did not answer that question. So trying to avoid as much as possible at this point of time to directly confront South Korea. So China is quite, and I think recently, July 1st, which is 7th of July, this South Korean Foreign Minister Park Jin, he met Wang Yi, Chinese Foreign Minister, in Bali G20 meeting. Actually, Wang Yi had no plan to meet Foreign Minister Park Jin, but last minute there was some change in schedule, and somehow it was accommodated. So I think China insisted that let's have work on win-win situation, win-win cooperation. But I think, as we know that South Korea is, I think, has to take into account all these things. And whatever foreign policy choices Yoon Suk-yeol administration takes, they have to be aware that there will be cost and benefit of that. So I think, because right now it seems that towards China, they are not making so many strong statements, but they are making many other statements like we want a kind of, say, like-minded democratic countries, rule of law, have a, you can say, free world. Actually, in inaugural address of Yoon Suk-yeol, according to one content analysis, I think he mentioned, I think, 14 times freedom world. So I think all these things are basically creating, you can say, quite a clear perception that with China, South Korea's relations are going to be problematic. But how far he takes that, I think, and how he manages that, I think it would be a challenge for South Korea. We in question answer we can talk about other, you can say, Japan or say North Korea and other, you can say, partners, other, you can say, countries, and how South Korean foreign policy is going to. One last thing I will talk about new Southern policy, and as Tyal said, told that bipartisan support. So both parties, liberal or conservative, they feel that India is a good, you can say, India and ASEAN countries, they are important. So I think that policy is going to continue apparently. They may change the name. The name New Southern Policy, actually, they have already come out with something called ABCD strategy. They call it ABCD, means advanced human capital, build health security, connect cultures, and digital Asian infrastructure policy. So ABCD policy there. So, but again, it's the content is going to be the similar. So I think I will stop myself here, and we will further discuss in question answer. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Mishra, for those very important remarks. And yes, there is a lot of difference between the pre-election rhetoric when candidates are speaking and the after election, once one assumes office, then the reality sets in. So moderation will certainly be there. But perhaps one could say that being a prosecutor general earlier, President Yoon has maybe more prone to see things in black and white, right and wrong. Whereas in foreign policy, international relations, dealing with countries, there are a lot of gray areas. And it is not easy to really choose a side. You have to work with all the sides. And I have also noted that China's response has been muted as far as South Korea is concerned. And like the Australians, they really pile on Australians whenever the Australians say something. So we have to see how they go. And trade dependence on China is a reality. And no Korean president or leadership can disregard that, because employment and all other economic growth issues are related to that. So thank you very much. I now invite Ms. Angana Guha Roy. She is a research associate at Delhi Policy Group, and her PhD thesis was on South Korea's New Asia Initiative, Search for Regional Power Status. And she has been writing on Indo-Pacific issues. So over to you, Angana. Are you there? Ms. Angana Guha.
She got freeze actually.
So I think she's facing some network issues. She should be able to join back in.
So one thing which was
Voice is not coming, Angana.
I can't see her on the screen.
No, Angana, we can see you, but I think we can't hear you.
Till she joins, one observation that the foreign policy establishment of President Yoon is very sort of ostensibly pro-US.
Yes.
Foreign Minister Park Jin was the chairman of the Korea-US Friendship Society. Prime Minister was a former ambassador to United States, and some of the closest advisors on foreign policy of President Yoon have been advocating a closer strategic relationship with the United States. Also, Angna, are you in? If not, I'll ask a question from President Lee, that President Yoon has been saying, and his policy advisors also, that all the issues with Japan should be settled in one package, the old issues and the present issues. Do you think it is a practical proposition, and what exactly is meant by that?
Well, President Yoon, obviously, he has a more proactive and more favorable, amicable attitude toward Japan in comparison with the Moon Jae-in administration. Well, it's irony in Korean politics. We all know that usually liberals tend to have a more open attitude toward some past issues and value issues. But interestingly, in Korean politics, particularly foreign policy toward Japan, liberals were much more hardline than conservative. So I would say Yoon Suk-yeol, he already mentioned several times that he will improve Korea-Japan relations in a future-oriented way. But that's the big aspiration. As we know, currently, many issues between Korea and Japan is not done overnight. It has been accumulated for the past long time. And currently, one of the big hurdle is the forced labor issue. So South Korean Supreme Court made some decision that Japanese government should officially apologize and make some compensation. But Japan government has never acknowledged that in terms of in legal sense. So that's just a part of the issue. Beyond that, for example, even though South Korea want to join a Quad, many South Korean people believe that Japan will decline that admission. Why? Japan believes South Korea may have some unshuffling role in destabilizing role in Quad and any multilateral organization that Japan has some important stake. And also recently, one of the new phenomenon between Korea and Japan is that in the past, usually it was government to government relationship that was bad. And most civilian people to people relationship has been much better than official relationship. But these days, if you look at the public opinion poll, both in Seoul and Tokyo, for example, they have very lowest ranking, which shows the favorable emotion toward each other. So perhaps even though Yoon Suk-yeol got to try hard to improve relationship with Japan, it will not improve dramatically in a very short period of time. So my suggestion is that both government, both Seoul and Tokyo should start with easy things. There are many things that we can do. For example, South Korea should stop regulating Japan's fishery product from Fukushima area. And Japan should stop regulating, restricting trade issue on the Korean part. I think that's non-political and very practical issue that both governments can start very easily. So step by step, and preventing this official relationship is getting worse. I think that's the what South Korean government and Japan should do right now.
Thank you very much.
Sir, Dr. Angana has.
Yeah, Dr. Angana, kindly, please, floor is yours. Dr. Angana Guharoy. Please go ahead, Dr. Angana.
Shruti, I think Dr. Angana is muted.
Yeah. Now I'm.
Okay.
Am I audible now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So sorry, sir. It was some technical mistake because of.
Not at all.
Sir, I completely agree with all the inferences drawn by Professor Mishra, and they were very insightful. And there is not much left to cover for me, but like how I look at this new administration is, there is a lot of rhetoric going on, like, ongoing rhetoric, whether it is for in the media, or drawing or exaggerating what has been, or taking that election pledge ahead for discussion. So the various contours through which these entire rhetorical analysis is being done is starts itself from the election pledge, which was a progression of the frustration among the people in South Korea because of the THAAD issue, where China had slapped sanctions on South Korea because of the THAAD issue, and then the cultural appropriation issue in the Winter Olympics, so which also added to it. So Yoon's election pledge about, he did say that he wants a Washington-centric foreign policy, but he also mentioned that he would want to conduct a foreign policy with, or enter into a bilateral foreign policy with China in pursuing, based on mutual respect. So, so after the election, and he also spoke about following a shuttle diplomacy, or a Kim Obuchi model for Japan South Korea relations, which would be more future oriented, and which would work on its a closer ties with Japan. There has been a lot that is being discussed, not only in in the international spectrum, but there are interesting insights in Chinese in the Chinese media, which I would refer. After the election pledge, there was the presidential ceremony, where we saw that Wang, am I audible?
Yes, Dr.
Yes, please.
We saw that China's vice president attending the ceremony, and he, which was a sign of Beijing's to persuade Yoon not to follow through on campaign promises to take a harder line on China. And after, if you remember after when Biden administration took over, how, China's spokesperson or Chinese media was extremely, rhetorically supporting or promoting, that, there is a new line where Biden would actually cultivate good relations with China. So this was same with, which happened with the Chinese Foreign Ministry and China's, media initially, who stated that China and the South Korea are and will remain close neighbors. We are also important cooperation partners. We are convinced that under the concerted efforts of the two sides, China-ROK relations will continuously make progress in keeping with the times. So there was that phase where China from the government front and on the media front, they were expressing that hope that that entire hardline stance will be neutralized. And then happened the Biden-Yoon summit, where there was more discussion about about preserving the peace and tranquility in the region, and respecting the international law and abiding by international law. Then there was this attendance of Yoon and Kishida in the NATO summit, which was again interpreted by China as a lack of South Korea's diplomatic independence. Then came the entire discussion around South Korea, around Yoon's willingness to join the Quad working groups, where he made it very clear that right now he wants to focus on very particular agenda like health, climate change, and all that. And he was definitely in favor of he has rhetorically indicated that there is a possibility of South Korea joining Quad later, but not right away. And meanwhile, if today's newspaper in Korea Herald, we have it was reported that China and South Korea just had a discussion on the FTA. They had an FTA meeting where they have discussed about bolstering their service and investment related relations. And so meanwhile there is but meanwhile again in the Yoon administration, we have seen that there has been a lot of talk about how South Korea needs to diversify its economic supply chains and economic dependence, and Europe could be one of the plausible place where South Korea engage with. And then there is this point of US, Japan, Korea trilateral. Now, when South Korea is actually, moving towards joining the Quad working groups, there is a very apparent thing that it is trying to improve its relation with all Quad members. First, it came with the US, but then he had also discussions with the Australian leadership. And then, as we have already seen that, Yoon had, said that definitely they want to bolster the strategic relationship with India. And now they have already, despite the low approval ratings of Japan, and there is, the image problem of Japan, definitely Yoon is willing to go ahead and neutralize South Korea's relations with Japan. So there is a lot of interesting discussion that is going on in Chinese media regarding these developments. These in this small span of time after Yoon joined. Yoon joined in May, and from March to May, there was this entire narrative where Chinese leadership and media was very hopeful about South Korea might be neutralizing the hardline stance, and but now it has it has just gone a little notch higher. And I will just draw your attention to few of them. When it comes to the South Korea and Japan relations, where the leadership wants to improve the relation with and mutually they are willing to talk it out and work it out. So the state media writes that Japan and South Korea should stick to the bottom line when it comes to their China policies. After all, the three nations are geographically close neighbors, but also highly complementary to each other in their economies. Following the US to continue to contain China is detrimental to Japan and Korea's security and economic interest. And when it comes to and very recently in South Korea is sent the largest contingent of its Navy fleet to RIMPAC. So it was also not very well received by Chinese, like China, which was reflected in its state media, which stresses that it sends a dangerous signal that Yoon administration is deviating from a neutral line amid China-US competition and losing diplomatic autonomy to serve the US Asia-Pacific strategy, which also faced concern in South Korea over relations and cooperation with China. One important reason that this I'm mentioning and drawing attention to is, as Professor Mishra, he mentioned that he very rightly and correctly, Professor Mishra has made this statement where he has said that there is always the rhetoric and there is a practice. We don't know, we have to take, time will tell. And so before the entire practice has started, or the implementation of the rhetoric of the election pledge has started, there is already so much of discussion in Chinese media and sensationalization of South Korea's foreign policy domain. Regarding the European, the leadership, South Korean leadership, to talk about diversifying supply chains, where the South Korean leadership has not said very aggressively, that we want to contain China or something. They have said that we want to diversify, like owing to China's own, focus on its own economic, because it is becoming more following a more domestic economic oriented policy. Recently, another Chinese state media said that the recent comments have reflected a desire among some South Korea to be less dependent on China in terms of supply chains, but it remains to be seen if such efforts will work. So. Then coming to the NATO participation of Yoon, the Chinese state media has said that China is closely paying attention to the three-way summit between US, Japan, and South Korea on the sidelines of the summit, in which the Korean Peninsula will be discussed, along with NATO's Asia's expansion against China. So this entire Chinese state media is constantly stressing on one point, that right now the entire collaboration, or entire Yoon's entire foreign policy discourse is aimed and unilaterally directed against containing China. Like, they are constantly using the word containment for that. And there was also a false report in the Chinese state media where, yes, Korean Herald and Korea Times has very recently reported that there was a fall in the approval rating of Yoon, but that was more because of certain domestic developments. But it was Chinese state media projected that it was Yoon's presence in NATO summit which has led to the fall in the approval rating. The Chinese state media didn't stop there. The worst and the most unfortunate thing, which I personally, which I think was very disgracefully put, was about Abe's assassination issue, where now they have in every, this is the world where there are so many increasing number of netizens. They write lots of things. There is so much of casual interaction. There is so much of irresponsible things that are being put here and there. But and China itself, we know how it refines and it restricts its own netizens from holding on any kind of democratic discussion or debate or any commenting. But what they did after the assassination of Abe is that they digged out one or two comments from the social media of South Korea and of South Korea and Taiwan, and they said that The assassination of the former Japanese PM has seemingly sounded the alarm on a bigger political crisis linked to emboldened conservative forces. And in this report, they have mentioned that there are netizens who are willing to kill Yoon in South Korea, and there are also netizens in Taiwan who are willing to kill Tsai because of their own conservative outlook towards politics, which is a clear provocation, and it's of really politically of bad taste. And South Korea's decision to join the working group of Quad, they have said that it will go beyond the China and South Korea strategic and cooperative partnership to undermine China's interest. If South Korea joins the alliance, it will likely become a variable factor similar to India. It may desperately pull South Korea to Quad to partially resist centrifugal forces from India. So now the entire Chinese state media has started sensationalizing each and every aspect of South Korea's foreign policy, and also, leading this influence operations, and posting a lot of these aggressive reports criticizing South Korea. And last but not the least, like how I look at it is, there are a lot of questions that has that we are that can only time can answer, that has to be observed in the coming times, which is that whether the US, Japan, South Korea trilateral cooperation, which is now improving, or which is now being boosted, will actually lead on to more closer an arms race in North Korea. Because again, Global Times, not only the Chinese state media, but also a lot of these Western think tank reports and all, they have said that there can be a increasing chances of arms race. I would like to know Professor Lee's opinion on that. And US and South Korea can now it's a great opportunity for US to cultivate closer ties with South Korea, people to people interaction. Like, it's already there, but now with this closer Quad working group tie and all, there will be bigger opportunities. And South Korea's with this decision to join IPEF, Quad working group, would not only bring it closer to US, but as Yoon has constantly stressed and mentioned, that they are interested to collaborate with like-minded democratic countries. So there could be, which actually indicates that if if South Korea is joining the entire the narrative, based on also the democratic principles. So in future, and India being the biggest democracy, we will have one more, stronger ally in the East, next to Japan. So we are, looking forward to, the coming times, and let's see how it pans out, and how the entire, discourse of the South Korean foreign policy gets implemented in the coming future. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Agna, for highlighting some trends.
Sorry, sir, my video was muted.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. now it is on. It's okay. So some trends on Korea-China relationship, Korea-US relationship, Korea-Quad, Korea-India. And so it is very much a work in progress. Thank you very much. We have some very interesting questions in the chat box. I'll start with the question which is directed to you, President Yi, from the President of the Institute of Chinese Studies, Ambassador Shokanta. And question is, how do you see, are you reading it in the chat box, President Yi?
Yeah, I can read.
Yeah, please, so kindly answer, reply.
So how South Korea will cope with the China's reaction with the strategic partners with the United States? So, and how Korea will manage its balance with these two key strategic relationships. And what happens if China and the US strategic competition is worsens in the future. I think that's one of the most important issue in South Korea foreign policy and most widely debated issue as well. But nevertheless, we don't have any clear answer yet. The reason is obvious. Okay, even though South Korea is alliance partner with the United States, and recently South Korea's Yoon government made it very clear that it will be with the US in its value-based diplomacy. But China is the reality that South Korea should face. You know, we already discussed that China's trade volume with South Korea is the much higher volume, much bigger volume than US, Japan, other countries combined. So even though Yoon Suk-yeol government allegedly declared that it will pursue and prioritize and value-based diplomacy with the United States, I would say South Korea is not in the position to ignore reality of the market. So on the one hand, we have a value. On the other hand, we have the interest. I think that's the reality that any diplomat should face in choice of their policy. So of course, the navigating between these two very complicated issues is not easy. As far as I know, any South Korea's previous government had made a clear answer for that. We are still in the process of making decisions. But as far as I understand, perhaps South Korea will permanently asking ourselves that what is the best option for Korea? Of course, it will be changing depending on times and depending on situations and how China's leadership perceives the South Korea position and how they view US-China context of the US-China strategic competition. So unfortunately, I don't have very clear-cut answer to this question, but I would say good foreign policy, good policy option is to make the best out of the impossible situation to make South Korea's national interest. So in between value and interest, value-based diplomacy and market, the forces of market, I think that's the two conundrum that South Korea should navigate in the future.
Thank you, President Ji. The second question is from Ambassador Vijay Nambiar, our former permanent representative to UN. Sandeep, can you read the question? I mean, you answer it first, and after that, it's addressed to everyone. After that, I'll request President Yi also to respond.
So the question is that whether there is any perception of decline of US inside Korea and China, emergence of China. And I think, is it possible that in coming times, I think some kind of modus vivendi would be evolved through which actually China, I think Korea accept that they are part of this common destiny with China. So,
I would say that South Korea is already making some relationship with China in terms of modus vivendi. Well, I would say there has been some notion that U.S. hegemony may be declining in the future. Interestingly, in Korea, majority of liberals have believed that way. Conservatives didn't buy that idea. But anyhow, it is obvious that U.S. influence in global politics is not as powerful as it was before. So that's the reality. But that does not necessarily mean that China can replace the influence position of the United States. So I would say some people in Korea, I would say minority of people, there is some belief that U.S. hegemony may be declining, and China may someday replace the position of the U.S. in this area. But I don't much agree with that view.
Sandeep, you would like to add something?
Yeah, I think it's largely covered, but I think yes, in my opinion, this choice is basically South Korea South Korean people or South Korean, you can say, policymakers, they don't like to have this choice, actually, this situation in which they have to take a choice. But they have been trying to avoid as much as possible one. The second thing is that if, because of China-US rivalry becoming more and more, you can say, intense, if South Korea doesn't have any choice, be it people or decision makers, and they have to take, you can say, side, it seems to me, given the, you can say, very seamless, you can say, connect between US and South Korea, I think South Korea would lean towards United States rather than China. And as you mentioned about lots of Koreans going to China, you know, latest data last year, 2022, I think around 43% decline in Korean students studying in China. So lots of economic activities, including other cultural and educational connects, they are getting they are getting shrink actually. So I think South Korea would like to avoid this contest, but I think if they have to choose, probably they will lean towards United States rather than China.
Thank you. The next question is again from Ambassador Shokanta. This is regarding ROK's relations with Japan under the new administration. I think President Yi has already sort of commented on this when I asked him this question. Angana, would you like to comment on it?
Which question, sir?
Ashok Kantha to everyone. How do you assess the prospects of ROK's relations with Japan under the new administration? Can it overcome grievances of the past in the face of shared contemporary interests with Japan, particularly vis-a-vis more assertive China?
Sir, I think that we have to look at this question in layers. The first thing is right now the rhetorical assertion where Yoon has come up with, he had come up with a very sensational, election pledge where, he has definitely talked about this Kim Obuchi, approach and taking ahead a future oriented relationship with Japan, which he has to definitely has to improve ties with Japan in case he has to work with the Quad Working Group, number one. Second, in case he has to improve the relations with the trilateral cooperation to counter the the Korean Peninsula thing. Third, if he's constantly stressing on the democratic principle and the necessity to abide by international law and order, which would definitely which challenges the China thing, then there is definitely a lot of room for South Korea to improve relations with Japan. But meanwhile, we have to also remember that there is a lot of this legacy memory of the past that South Koreans hold and carry about the past of Japan in Korea. So and the approval and the common people, they have not yet got over the pain and the trauma of the past. So in future, how the entire administration discourse progresses, and how, if there is a lot of domestic there is a lot of domestic dissent, which we have seen, there is a certain kind of the Yoon's approval ratings are falling. So if and the government has to do things in tandem with and taking into consideration the goodwill of the people, then they won't be able to actually ignore a lot of this in this public opinion. But so one option for the government would be to strengthen the anti-China narrative in the people, where people try to understand and balance their attitude towards the trauma of the past and the necessity of the of the contemporary times, where it's important to also challenge China. So we have to see that if in the future there is any kind of domestic controversy, or how the entire discourse of the administration progresses, that would a lot. So that's why I said that, like, it depends on the layers of time So that also depends, how it progresses. Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you. One question is regarding South Korea's membership in this Indo-Pacific economic framework. And can it be seen as reflection to President Yoon's foreign policy? And how exactly South Korea will participate in it? Would you like to take that, Professor Mishra?
Yeah. May I answer, respond
Yeah,
to that?
please, President Lee.
Well, President Yoon already made it clear that South Korea will join IPEF. So I think that's the part of the this government initiative that we already suffering from very limited supply chain issue. We are suffering, for example, South Korea's foreign trade is heavily dependent on China's supply chain. So we already learned many lessons since the third deployment issue in Korea. China revenged heavily on the South Korean companies and so on. And also because of the, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we already have a very heavy pressure from energy security issue. So given that perhaps a more flexible supply chain, I think that's one of the important issue for Yoon government. That's why Yoon government is trying to join IPEF as soon as possible. But that does not necessarily mean that South Korea will oppose any China-initiated a similar framework like RCEP. And South Korea is also joined the RCEP initiated by China. So as much as diverse network and partnership, I think that's what South Korea government is trying to do.
Thank you very much. Another question from Ms. Yukti Pawar is regarding speculation that South Korea might join the Quad Plus framework under President Yoon. And her query is, are these speculations realistic in nature? Professor Mishra, you would like to take that?
Yeah, I think it's not realistic. It's real actually, in the sense in 2020 when Quad Plus meeting happened, South Korea participated. Quad Plus is basically, there are two ways to describe Quad Plus. One Quad Plus which happened in 2020, it means that new soft issues are going to be included in Quad agenda items. And that happened in 2020 when they talked about vaccines, they talked about health, they talked about in the pandemic period, how we are going to continue economic, you can say, exchange with one another. So South Korea was part of that. So actually, when it comes to economic cooperation, apart from CPTPP, most of the other platforms which come, like where South Korea could join, I can give you AIIB. South Korea has been, you can say, founding member of AIIB, which was initiated by China. Actually, South Korea has also been not very negative towards BRI. Actually, they have accepted the BRI also. Then comes to, I think, President Lee mentioned about RCEP. I think IPEFP, like Indo-Pacific. So I think they feel that in economic domain, wherever there are possibilities, we need to take them and we need to utilize them. So I think Quad Plus and both IPFP, they are not only realistic, but they have become real. That's what that means. And next question to me.
Yeah,
again,
please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, about this domestic setup of how much domestic variables they and what is the direction of domestic influence on South Korean foreign policy. Actually, in my presentation, I tried to tell you that whatever departure point a political party, a political leader takes in South Korea, what happened that ultimately on a very bigger frame, South Korean foreign policy doesn't change a lot. So I'm saying that because it's a fractured in the sense, Mr. Tyal mentioned, President Lee mentioned about that, and then I also talked about that since South Korea, they just suppose in case of Japan relations, even if Yoon Suk-yeol is trying to mitigate all the problematic issues from the bilateral relations, the people who are not in favor of good relations with Japan, or rather they are apprehensive about Japan, they feel that Japan is still not very remorseful, sincerely. So they are going to have a critical voice. So ultimately, we can't expect big changes. So I think it's coming to this, like how much what is the direction? The direction is basically quite mixed. And that's why the foreign policy outcomes are also going to be mixed. And I think that's what I wanted to say.
Let me jump in a little bit.
Yes,
Well,
please.
I agree with Sandeep in that in Korean politics, usually the difference between liberal and conservative are visible only in just a very particular cases, like how can we better handle North Korea? How can we handle Korea-US alliance, etc. Other than that, perhaps foreign policy stance and policy ingredient of both liberal and conservative are quite overlapping. So I agree in the sense that policy options for South Korea in any other issues are quite overlapping and very limited.
Thank you very much. We still have 1 or 2 questions, but we are running out of time. So I thank the panelists for this very interesting discussion. The President Yoon has just taken over. It is a 5-year term. It is a work in progress. Some trends are there, but the reality will set in. And as President Yi said, perhaps, and Dr. Mishra also said, that there may not be too much of a departure from the past foreign policy which has been followed by the previous regimes. So thank you very much, and thanks to the Institute of Chinese Studies for organizing this very topical, very important discussion. Thank you very much, all the participants and all the listeners, all the audience.